November 17, 1864, Richmond, Virginia. The Confederate capital trembles under siege as Union cannons echo in the distance like the drumbeat of destiny itself. In the cold shadow of a crumbling tobacco warehouse on Canal Street, a child stands on an auction block, barefoot, shivering, his wrists bound with fraying rope. His name is Thomas Freeman, though no one has called him by it in months. He is 7 years old. The auctioneer's voice cuts through the autumn air like a blade. $3 for the boy. $3, gentlemen. Going once. The boy's eyes, dark and unblinking, stare not at the crowd but beyond it, toward something no one else can see, toward a future that will carve his name into the bones of a nation. This is not just the sale of a child. This is the final gasp of an empire built on blood and chains. The last desperate transaction of men who sense their world collapsing but refuse to release their grip. Thomas Freeman's auction represents the grotesque endgame of the Confederacy's peculiar institution, a system so morally bankrupt that even as their armies retreated and their currency became worthless, slaveholders still sought profit from human flesh. $3. The price of a loaf of bread, a bottle of whiskey, a pair of worn boots. That is what they valued him at. But what they could not know, what the sweating, desperate men in that crowd could never foresee, was that this child would survive, would testify, would become the living evidence that would help dismantle the legal foundations of slavery itself and reshape the constitutional future of America. The story you are about to witness is not folklore. It is not legend softened by time or myth polished for comfort. It is documented history, pulled from the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau, from congressional testimony, from the handwritten records of Union officers who found Thomas Freeman 3 months after this auction, starved, scarred, but alive. This is the narrative of how one child's suffering became the catalyst for legal revolution, how his testimony before Congress in 1866 influenced the drafting of the 14th Amendment, and how his very existence challenged the nation to confront the unforgivable truth of what it had become. If you believe that individual lives can alter the trajectory of history, that innocence can carry more power than armies, then stay with us. Subscribe to Bear Witness. Comment with the courage this story demands. Because Thomas Freeman's life is not just history, it is a reckoning. Thomas Freeman was born in the spring of 1857 on the Callaway Plantation, a sprawling estate of 2,000 acres that stretched along the James River like a scar across the Virginia landscape. His mother, Esther Freeman, was a house servant, a woman of quiet dignity, who moved through the master's halls like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only when labor was required. His father's name was never recorded, lost to the deliberate erasure that slavery practiced with surgical precision. Esther had named her son Thomas after her own father, a man she barely remembered, sold south when she was 4 years old. The name was an act of defiance, a thread connecting past to future, in a world designed to sever all such connections. Thomas grew up in the slave quarters, a row of crude wooden cabins that leaked in winter and baked in summer, where families crowded together in spaces barely fit for livestock. But Esther taught him something the slaveholders could never take. She taught him his name mattered. She taught him to remember it, to hold it in his mouth like a secret weapon. "You are Thomas Freeman," she would whisper to him in the darkness before sleep. "Freeman, remember that word, child. Remember it." She could not have known how prophetic that name would become. How it would one day be spoken in the halls of Congress, recorded in the archives of constitutional law, etched into the memory of a nation trying to birth itself anew. The Callaway Plantation was overseen by Master Edmund Callaway, a man whose cruelty was not explosive but methodical, a coldness that made him more dangerous than the whip-wielding overseers who worked beneath him. Edmund was 43 in 1864, a Virginia gentleman educated at William and Mary, a man who quoted scripture at breakfast and calculated the monetary value of human beings by dinner. He wore fine suits even as the Confederacy collapsed around him, maintaining the fiction of aristocracy while his world rotted from within. His wife, Margaret, was a pale wraith of a woman who spent her days in the parlor, embroidering pillowcases and pretending not to hear the screams from the fields. They had 3 children, all grown, all enlisted in the Confederate Army, all dead by the summer of 1864. Edmund never spoke their names after the telegrams arrived. Instead, he became obsessed with control, with preserving what remained of his empire, even as Union forces closed in from the north and west. He began selling off slaves in desperate transactions, liquidating human assets to fund his own escape. Thomas's mother, Esther, had begged him, literally on her knees, not to separate her from her son. Edmund Callaway looked down at her with the indifference of a man swatting a fly and said, "The boy will fetch a price." That is all that matters now. The auction house on Canal Street was run by a man named Silas Grendel, a broker of human misery who had grown wealthy on the commerce of flesh. Grendel was not a plantation owner himself. He was something worse. He was a facilitator, a middleman who claimed moral distance from the institution he profited from. "I merely conduct business," he would say, as if the act of selling children was no different from trading tobacco or cotton. The warehouse itself was a cathedral of suffering, a two-story brick structure where hundreds of enslaved people had passed through its doors, shackled and catalogued like livestock. The walls were lined with iron rings where chains were fastened. The floor was stained dark with decades of sweat, blood, and tears. On the day Thomas Freeman was brought there, November 17th, the building reeked of unwashed bodies and fear. Grendel walked through the holding pen with a ledger, recording names, ages, physical conditions. When he reached Thomas, he gripped the boy's jaw, forcing his mouth open to inspect his teeth. "Healthy enough," Grendel muttered. "Small for his age, but he'll grow. Field work or house service. Either way, he's worth something." Thomas did not cry. He had learned early that tears were a currency wasted on men who had none to give in return. Instead, he stood silent, his small hands clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the far wall where a crack in the bricks let in a single beam of November sunlight. The auction began at noon. 23 enslaved people were lined up on the platform that day. Men, women, children, ranging from infants to the elderly. The crowd was smaller than usual. The war had drained Richmond of its wealth and its delusions. Those who remained were the desperate, the dealers, the scavengers picking at the bones of a dying civilization. Thomas was the 14th person brought to the block. Grendel's assistant, a scarred man named Polk, dragged him forward by the arm and positioned him center stage beneath the auctioneer's hammer. "Lot 14, Grendel announced, his voice echoing off the warehouse rafters. "Negro boy, age 7, name of Thomas. Sound body, no visible defects, suitable for training in domestic service or field labor. Bidding starts at $2. Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. $2 was laughably low, an insult to the institution itself, but it reflected the economic collapse of the Confederacy. Confederate currency was nearly worthless. Even human lives, once valued in the thousands, had plummeted in price. Finally, a voice called out. A tobacco merchant named Harlan Voss, a man with a pockmarked face and hands stained yellow from years of handling leaf. $2, Voss said, more out of boredom than interest. Another voice followed. $2.50. A third. $3. Grendel's eyes narrowed. $3. For a child. For a future. For a life. Going once, he said. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained stone. Going twice. The hammer rose. And then it fell. Thomas was purchased by a man named Josiah Creel, a former overseer turned independent trader who specialized in buying slaves at rock-bottom prices and reselling them in the deeper South, where Confederate loyalists still clung to the fantasy that the war could be won. Creel was a mountain of a man, 6'4", with a beard matted with tobacco juice and eyes the color of dirty ice. He grabbed Thomas by the back of the neck and marched him out of the warehouse without a word, his grip so tight the boy's vision swam with black spots. They walked through the streets of Richmond, past the burned-out buildings, past the Confederate hospitals overflowing with wounded soldiers, past the bread riots and the desperate crowds. Thomas tried to look back once, toward the direction of the Callaway plantation, toward some impossible hope that his mother might appear, might run to him, might save him. But she did not come. She could not. Creel loaded Thomas into the back of a covered wagon along with 4 other recently purchased slaves, a teenage girl named Ruth, 2 middle-aged men whose names he never learned, and an elderly woman who coughed blood into a rag. The wagon rolled south, away from Richmond, away from everything Thomas had ever known. For 3 days they traveled, stopping only when Creel needed to water the horses or relieve himself. They were fed once a day, cornmeal mush and water. They slept chained together in the wagon bed, the cold November air seeping through gaps in the canvas cover. The old woman died on the 2nd night. Creel discovered her body the next morning, cursed, and dumped her in a ditch by the side of the road without ceremony. On the 4th day, everything changed. They were camped in a clearing near the North Carolina border when the sound of hoofbeats shattered the pre-dawn silence. Thomas woke to shouting, Creel's voice roaring in fury, then cut short by the crack of rifle fire. Union cavalry. A patrol of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, a regiment of black soldiers led by white officers, had been tracking Confederate supply lines and had stumbled upon Creel's wagon by chance. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant named William Hargrove, dismounted and approached the wagon with his pistol drawn. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thomas and the remaining captives were chained, starving, barely conscious. Ruth, the teenage girl, had been brutally assaulted by Creel the night before and lay in a pool of her own blood. One of the men had infected lash wounds across his back, the flesh green with gangrene. Lieutenant Hargrove ordered the chains cut immediately. He wrapped Thomas in his own Union coat and carried him to the medical wagon. "What is your name, son?" Hargrove asked, his voice shaking with rage and sorrow. Thomas looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had aged decades in a single week. "Thomas Freeman," the boy whispered. It was the first time he had spoken his full name in days. Hargrove wrote it down in his field journal, underlining it twice. That entry, that single notation, in a Union officer's journal, would become one of the most important documents in the legal battle to define citizenship and personhood in post-war America. Lieutenant William Hargrove was 26 years old, a Harvard graduate who had enlisted in 1862 driven by abolitionist fervor and a romantic belief in the righteousness of the Union cause. But the war had stripped away his romanticism, replacing it with a cold, furious clarity about the moral obscenity of slavery. He had seen too many plantations, too many auction houses, too many children with scars across their backs and emptiness in their eyes. Thomas Freeman became, for Hargrove, a symbol, not just of slavery's victims, but of the urgent necessity to ensure such atrocities could never be legally sanctioned again. He took personal responsibility for Thomas's care, ensuring the boy received medical treatment, food, and shelter as the regiment made its way back toward Union lines. Hargrove also did something unusual. He documented everything. He recorded Thomas's testimony about the auction, about the Callaway plantation, about Josiah Creel's brutality. He photographed Thomas's scars, the marks of beatings administered by overseers, the rope burns on his wrists, the malnourishment that had left his ribs visible beneath his skin. These photographs, grim and unflinching, would later be entered into evidence before Congress. Hargrove understood that the war's end would bring legal battles as fierce as any fought on battlefields. Questions about citizenship, about rights, about the very definition of personhood would need to be answered. And Thomas Freeman's story, his mere existence, was the kind of undeniable, visceral evidence that could not be dismissed or rationalized away by those who sought to preserve white supremacy through legal means. By January 1865, Thomas had been placed in the care of the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency established to assist formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom. He was housed in a refuge camp outside Washington, D.C., where hundreds of freed slaves lived in tents and makeshift shelters, struggling to understand what freedom meant in practical terms. Thomas was one of the youngest residents. He rarely spoke, spending his days sitting by the camp's perimeter, staring north toward Richmond, toward the plantation where his mother remained. A teacher named Abigail Morse, a Quaker woman from Philadelphia who volunteered at the camp, took special interest in Thomas. She taught him to read and write, not the sanitized primers used for white children, but radical abolitionist texts, Frederick Douglass's writings, the words of men and women who had fought and died for freedom. Thomas absorbed everything with a hunger that startled her. Within 6 months, he could read fluently. Within a year, he was writing his own account of his experiences, a document that Abigail carefully preserved and would later submit to congressional committees. But education could not erase trauma. Thomas woke screaming most nights, reliving the auction, the wagon, the casual violence of men like Creel and Callaway. Abigail would sit with him in the darkness, holding his hand, reminding him that he was safe, that he was free, that his life had value beyond the $3 someone had once paid for him. "You are a witness, Thomas," she told him one night. "Your life is testimony, and testimony has power." In the spring of 1866, the United States Congress was locked in bitter debate over the terms of Reconstruction and the legal status of formerly enslaved people. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but questions remained. Were Black Americans citizens? Did they possess the same constitutional rights as white Americans? Could states restrict their freedoms through discriminatory laws? The radical Republicans, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, argued for sweeping federal protections and a constitutional guarantee of citizenship and equal rights. Conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans resisted, fearing federal overreach and the social upheaval of true racial equality. Into this charged atmosphere, Lieutenant Hargrove submitted his documentation of Thomas Freeman's case to the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. The committee, intrigued by the narrative's power, summoned Thomas to testify. On April 12, 1866, Thomas Freeman, now 9 years old, walked into the U.S. Capitol building wearing a new suit provided by Abigail Morse, his small hand gripping hers as they climbed the marble steps. The committee room was packed with congressmen, journalists, and observers. Thomas was led to a chair before the panel of stern-faced white men who would decide his nation's future. Representative John Bingham of Ohio, the principal architect of what would become the 14th Amendment, leaned forward and spoke gently. "Thomas, can you tell us what happened to you in November of 1864? Thomas looked at him with those same dark, unblinking eyes that had stared beyond the auction crowd 2 years earlier. And then, in a clear, steady voice that silenced the room, he began to speak. He told them everything. Thomas's testimony lasted 47 minutes, but its impact would reverberate through the halls of American jurisprudence for generations. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, recounting the auction with a precision that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats. He described the price, $3, and the way Silas Grendel had inspected his teeth like he was livestock. He described Josiah Creel's brutality, the death of the old woman in the ditch, the rifle crack that had announced his liberation. But what shook the committee most profoundly was not the catalog of horrors. They had heard such stories before, had dismissed them as abolitionist propaganda or unfortunate excesses of a flawed but economically necessary system. What shook them was Thomas himself, his intelligence, his dignity, his ability to articulate not just what had happened to him, but what it meant. "They said I was worth $3, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the committee room. But my mother told me I was worth more than all the money in Virginia. She told me I was a person, not a thing. She told me my name was Freeman and that one day it would be true." Representative Thaddeus Stevens, the fiery radical Republican from Pennsylvania, removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Representative Bingham scribbled furiously in his notebook, his hand trembling. Even the conservative Democrats who had come prepared to dismiss the testimony as theater found themselves unable to look away from this child who spoke with the moral authority of a prophet. The journalists present that day wrote breathless accounts for their newspapers, describing Thomas as a living refutation of every lie ever told to justify the enslavement of his race. The testimony was transcribed, distributed to every member of Congress, and read into the congressional record. Photographs of Thomas, including Hargrove's documentation of his scars, were passed from hand to hand, forcing legislators to confront the physical evidence of the system they had tolerated or defended. The reaction to Thomas Freeman's testimony split along predictable lines, but with cracks appearing in unexpected places. The radical Republicans seized upon it as irrefutable proof that federal constitutional protections were not just necessary, but morally imperative. Thaddeus Stevens delivered a thunderous speech on the House floor, holding up Thomas's photograph and demanding to know how any civilized nation could permit such atrocities to occur under the protection of law. "This child," Stevens declared, his voice shaking with rage, "was bought and sold like a mule. His personhood was denied. His humanity was auctioned for the price of a cheap bottle of whiskey. And now we are asked to trust that the states which enslaved him will voluntarily protect his rights? Madness. We must enshrine in our Constitution an unambiguous declaration that all persons born in this nation are citizens, endowed with equal protection under law, beyond the reach of any state to diminish or destroy." But the opposition was fierce. Democratic representatives from border states and northern cities with racist constituencies argued that Thomas's case, while tragic, was an outlier, a piece of abolitionist propaganda designed to justify federal tyranny over state sovereignty. Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky called the testimony the manipulation of a traumatized child for political purposes. Representative Andrew Rogers of New Jersey claimed that granting citizenship and equal rights to former slaves would lead to the mongrelization of the white race and the destruction of Christian civilization. Debates raged for weeks, vitriolic and vicious, with Thomas Freeman's name invoked dozens of times by both sides. Through it all, Thomas remained in Washington, staying with Abigail Morse, attending a school for freed children, and carrying the weight of knowing that his suffering had become a battleground upon which the future of his people would be decided. He was 9 years old, and he had become the most famous formerly enslaved child in America, a symbol, an argument, a living challenge to the nation's conscience. Pause here, if you will, and consider what you have witnessed. A child, sold for $3, chained in a wagon, left to die, now standing before the architects of a nation, speaking truth that cannot be unspoken. This is not a story that asks for your comfort. It demands your attention, your memory, your willingness to bear witness to what was done and what was overcome. If Thomas Freeman's voice could echo through marble halls and change the course of constitutional law, then your voice, your engagement, your sharing of this story carries weight too. Subscribe to ensure these histories are never forgotten, never sanitized, never reduced to footnotes. Comment with the names of those you know who need to hear this. Share this narrative as an act of remembrance, as testimony that truth, no matter how painful, must be preserved. Thomas spoke when silence would have been easier. What will you do with what you now know? The story continues and the climax approaches, but only those who choose to remember will understand its full weight. On June 13, 1866, Congress passed what would become Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The language was carefully crafted, debated word by word, but its core principle was revolutionary and unambiguous. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Representative John Bingham, the amendment's primary architect, would later write in his private correspondence that Thomas Freeman's testimony had crystallized his thinking on the necessity of the Equal Protection Clause. "I could not erase from my mind the image of that child," Bingham wrote, "standing before us with a dignity that shamed us all, asking not for charity but for recognition of his inherent humanity. If our Constitution cannot protect such a child, then it is not worthy of the name." The amendment passed the Senate on June 8th and the House on June 13th. Then began the arduous process of state ratification. It would take 2 more years, until July 9, 1868, for the required 3/4 of states to ratify it. But when it finally became law, it fundamentally transformed the relationship between individuals and their government. Thomas Freeman's name does not appear in the amendment's text, but every legal scholar, every historian who traces the 14th Amendment's genesis, encounters his testimony in the congressional record, his photographs in the archives, his story woven into the fabric of constitutional revolution. He was the $3 child who helped price freedom at infinity. Thomas Freeman's life after his testimony was both extraordinary and heartbreakingly ordinary. Abigail Morse became his legal guardian, raising him in Philadelphia, where he attended integrated schools, a privilege newly won and fiercely contested. He proved to be a brilliant student, particularly in mathematics and literature, but he carried his trauma like a second shadow. Nightmares haunted him well into adulthood. He never found his mother. Esther Freeman's fate remains unknown, lost to the chaos of war and the deliberate destruction of slave records by fleeing Confederates. Thomas spent years searching, placing advertisements in newspapers, writing to the Freedmen's Bureau, visiting Virginia during the summers of his teenage years to walk through abandoned plantations and speak to elderly former slaves who might remember her. He never found her. That loss became the defining absence of his life, a wound that never fully healed. In 1875, at age 18, Thomas enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, becoming one of the first generation of black students to pursue higher education in integrated American institutions. He studied law, a choice that surprised no one who knew him. "If the law can be used to enslave," he wrote in his application essay, "then it can be used to liberate. I intend to master the language of my oppression and turn it into the language of my freedom." He graduated in 1879 with honors, passed the Pennsylvania bar exam on his first attempt, and opened a small practice in Philadelphia specializing in civil rights cases. For the next 40 years, Thomas Freeman would be a quiet but relentless advocate for Black Americans navigating the legal system that had once valued them at $3 or less. Thomas Freeman died on February 3, 1921, at the age of 63, in his modest Philadelphia office, surrounded by law books and case files. He had never married, had no children, had lived a life of monastic dedication to his work. His obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune described him as a pioneer of civil rights jurisprudence, whose testimony as a child helped shape the 14th Amendment. But even that recognition, respectful as it was, could not capture the full scope of what his life had meant. In the decades following his death, Thomas Freeman faded from public memory, a footnote in Reconstruction histories, a name mentioned briefly in legal textbooks analyzing the 14th Amendment's origins. The institutional forces of American amnesia, the desire to forget the uncomfortable truths of slavery and Reconstruction, worked to erase him as they had erased so many others. His papers were donated to Lincoln University's archives, where they gathered dust for decades. His photograph, the same one Representative Stevens had held aloft in Congress, was filed away in the Library of Congress, cataloged but rarely viewed. The nation moved on, as nations do, preferring myths of inevitable progress to the messy reality of hard-won rights and incomplete justice. But history has a way of resurrecting the voices it needs. In the 1950s and 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement, researchers rediscovered Thomas Freeman's testimony. Thurgood Marshall, arguing Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court, cited the 14th Amendment's origins and the testimony of formerly enslaved people who had fought for its passage. Thomas Freeman's name appeared in Marshall's briefs. His story was told in documentaries and textbooks, in the growing literature of civil rights history that refused to let such witnesses be forgotten. Today, if you visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., you will find Thomas Freeman's photograph displayed in the exhibition on Reconstruction. The caption reads, "Thomas Freeman, age 7, sold for $3 in Richmond, Virginia, November 1864. His testimony before Congress in 1866 influenced the drafting of the 14th Amendment." Beside the photograph is a copy of his testimony, the words preserved behind glass like a sacred text. School children press their faces close to read it, teachers explain its significance, and visitors from around the world stand in silence before this image of a child who refused to be erased. His story has become a teaching tool, a moral cornerstone, a reminder that constitutional rights are not gifts bestowed by benevolent governments, but demands made by those willing to speak truth in the face of power. Legal scholars still cite his testimony in articles analyzing the original intent of the 14th Amendment. His name appears in Supreme Court opinions, most recently in Obergefell versus Hodges, where Justice Kennedy's majority opinion extended equal protection to same-sex couples, building on the foundation that Thomas Freeman helped lay 150 years earlier. The $3 that once defined his value has become a symbol of the grotesque calculus of oppression, a number so obscene it forces us to confront the depths of American moral failure. But more than that, Thomas Freeman's life stands as proof that individual testimony matters, that speaking truth, even as a powerless child, can echo across centuries and reshape nations. He was 7 years old when they tried to reduce him to a price. He was 9 when he stood before Congress and declared his humanity. He was 63 when he died, still fighting. And he is eternal now, his name woven into the fabric of American constitutional law, his voice still speaking from the archives, still demanding that we remember. Listen, on quiet nights in the reading rooms of law libraries, when young lawyers study constitutional law and trace the evolution of civil rights from the 14th Amendment forward, Thomas Freeman's words rise from the pages like incantations. They said I was worth $3, but my mother told me I was worth more than all the money in Virginia. That sentence, simple, devastating true, contains the entire moral architecture of the civil rights movement, the entire argument against oppression, the entire claim to human dignity that no law can grant because it exists prior to law, beneath law, beyond the reach of any auction block or any constitution. Thomas Freeman was not a hero in the traditional sense. He did not lead armies or deliver soaring speeches to thousands. He was a child who survived, who remembered, who spoke when it mattered most, His heroism was the heroism of endurance, of refusal to be silenced, of insisting on his own humanity when the world conspired to deny it. And in that insistence, he helped birth a legal principle that would protect millions yet unborn. The $3 slave child who changed the course of American history, not through violence, not through wealth, not through political power, but through testimony, through the simple revolutionary act of telling the truth about what had been done to him and demanding that it never be done again. His name is Thomas Freeman, and if you remember nothing else from this story, remember that. Remember the constitutional rights were won by people like him, the traumatized, the disposable, the ones valued at $3 who insisted they were worth infinity. Remember, and pass the memory on, because in remembering, we honor not just Thomas Freeman, but every person who ever stood against injustice armed with nothing but truth. Their voices echo still. Listen closely. You can hear them,